So I'm joined with Neil Gibb this week, who's an old friend of mine and ex-colleague, author of The Participation Revolution, which is a great book. If you haven't read it, you should check it out. And we want to talk a little bit about what it means to be human in this current age of AI and how we're changing and how we're adapting to use current technologies and what it means for us. So I thought it'd be a great place to start if we look at this world which is engineered for distraction, are we actually losing our ability to think critically? And if that is the case, then how do we reclaim it? How do we do something about it? What are your thoughts, Neil?
Yeah, I'd say yes and no. We've talked a lot in the past about neurology and brain plasticity. I think what's happening for a lot of people, and I'd probably fall into this trap as well, is I spend too much time leaning right into a small box and looking at it and responding to content. Now, whether my brain is permanently rewiring itself or not, I don't know. But I think what it does is it creates a narrowing of focus. So when you do that, you can't join up dots. You can't see the big picture. And it's in some ways, it's simple. If you want to see the big picture, you have to step back. And I think at a time like this, there's a real desire to lean in to try and work out what's happening and keep up with the news, when really it's about seeing the patterns. So I think it's a practice that a lot of us have probably lost, that we have to practice. It's about discipline.
I like the way you framed that. I think from my point of view, I've become a big believer in Daniel Kahneman's System 1 and System 2 thinking, where System 1 thinking is your automatic brain mechanisms which you do without really putting too much effort into it. So things like tying your shoelaces or making a coffee on autopilot. Whereas your System 2 thinking is when you actually sit down and focus and start to pick apart why and how you're breaking down problems. And unfortunately, I think we've moved into this world, this society, which is very much geared towards System 1 thinking. A lot of the things we engage with on a daily basis now, things like digital marketing, these short clips, videos that we doom scroll through every night before we go to bed, if you're anything like me, and things like AI, they're all geared up to very fast answers, very quick emotional engagement, but there's fire and forget, so consume and then on to the next thing. So my concern and my worry with that is that by constantly consuming these things and getting our brains used to them, we do exactly what you described, in that we detrain our brains, and there is brain plasticity to, if that's how we're thinking, if that's how we're operating, we change and adapt to be better at that. So we're getting very good at reacting, very good at responding, but we don't spend as much time actually thinking. And I think when you start to combine that with some other bad habits that we have, like staying up really late and reducing how much REM sleep you have, you start to then impact how well you can process in the brain, how good your memory stores are. And I think there's some real dangers that we're blindly walking into. You can also start to pair in things like echo chambers, where I think we're adaptive to digital engagement now. A lot of our friendship engagements are, we're no longer go down the pub to talk to people, or not as much. We tend to talk online, things like Facebook and Twitter, but we tend to talk with people who agree with us more. We end up engaging in echo chambers far more than maybe we did in the past. We don't have as much dissent. So this group intelligence that we have becomes quite reduced. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think as well, we often look at things, say what's going on with the American government at the moment. We look at things as if the thing that's just happened has changed everything, when the thing that's just happened is usually the end point of something. There's been something moving us towards it. And it's the same with AI. A lot of people in the creative industry saying it's stealing our creativity. But there's a great philosopher called Mark Fisher. I can't remember the name of the book. I think it's called Ghosts of the Future, round about the turn of the century. He sadly passed away in lockdown. And he talked about how culture ended round about the year 2000. And he said, the way that you can measure culture is if you take something from today and take it back 30 years, people would have no idea what it was. And he used particularly pop culture. So, if you took hip hop from 1990 back to the early 60s, particularly rap, stuff, aggressive rap, people will be like, that's when the Beatles were, singing love songs. And you can see that until round about the turn of the century, when you had Adele and you had Amy Winehouse, who were basically singing 50 songs. If you took that back 30 years, it would have been very familiar. So to some extent, since then, we've been recycling. So human beings were recycling anyway. And we've seen it in brands. It's quite insidious. Once upon a time, certain, say, clothing brands were famous for a certain jacket. But if a jacket's popular, now everyone makes it. So even high fashion people do hoodies and tracksuit bottoms, whatever it is, So we've become very sort of, the creative has become a lot about mimicry, and all AI has done is mechanize that. So I think the interesting challenge now is, given that is now being mechanized, is to remember what human beings used to be able to do, maybe before the turn of the century, which is do stuff that's unusual, unique, and at the time maybe surprising and even offensive. The Sex Pistols were.
Yeah, interesting. I think there's a couple of points in that to pick apart. One thing that jumps out to me is that through tools, particularly AI tools, but digital generally over the last 20 years, and AI is really just a further acceleration, we've managed to lower the bar or democratize the ability to create far greater than anything we've ever seen before. So far more people are creating things to consume, and I don't mean things like these podcasts, but genuinely creative endeavors. You're seeing more people are able to actually engage without having to necessarily spend 20 years learning a craft to do so. I think the trouble is with that, when you start to pair it with what you're talking about, this lack of risk taking, where we know there's a safe option, a bit like movies where the studios can churn out 100 Marvel films because they know people will consume them, and maybe they're not going to advance human art and advance the human condition. They'll entertain a lot of people though. They play it quite safe. But if we lose the risk taking, which we're very good at, I think we lose the ability to generate novel, genuinely interesting things. So I have a strong opinion that we've widened the ability to create now by making it much easier for people. And I think that genuinely talented, thoughtful people will rise to the top of this. I think we will start to see a value placed on people who can lift themselves above the massive generated content. I know there's a lot of concern at the moment about will AI take our jobs. Actually, I think it will, but it's the lower end of things which could and should be automated. Whereas the genuine craftsmen, I think, will absolutely stand out because they can stand out, because they are thoughtful, because they think about what they're creating. And by doing so, they create something interesting. And by creating something interesting, more people engage with it more deeply, which I think is a great thing to be celebrated. And I'm hoping we'll see more people able to do this because they're not as limited by the need to spend 20 years crafting. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and the and is, I think we live in this creator economy, and it misses a point really, I think, which is, yes, everyone can create, but what used to be the constraint on creativity wasn't the ability to create, it was the ability to be distributed. You might have to use a recording studio, but anyone could play a guitar in the garage with their friends and record it on a tape. But it was actually getting a record deal, the record being made, the record being put into the stores, getting into the music business. So it was distribution. As Coca-Cola realized they're a distribution business, not a soft drinks business. And so I think the issue here is two things playing against us. One is, so a lot of stuff, which is okay, but not great, would be filtered out because it just wouldn't end up in front of us. Now, because anyone can distribute anything, everything's in front of us. Then the next thing we have is the algorithms, which are not looking for difference, they're looking for similarity. So if that unique and special thing comes along, it's going to go, well, you're not interested in that because you're interested in this. So I think that's going to be the interesting challenge. I agree absolutely that uniqueness is going to be premium and how to get on in the world, but how to get noticed is going to be the next interesting marketing challenge, I think.
So the other thread I'd like to pull on a little bit is, if we accept that you are going to be able to differentiate still through craft and through skill and experience, and there is a definite need for it, how can we take some of the principles and apply them in even less creative endeavors? How can we apply them in sort of day-to-day tasks to try and get some of that creativity, to try and encourage that innovation when we know that we're training ourselves to be these reactive, fast-paced, task-switching machines that are augmented by actual machines? How do we actually pause and slow down a little bit? And I think there are a few ways we can do that. So I'll give you some of mine, but I'd quite be interested to hear some of yours as well. So I think the obvious ones for me are to actively make time to pick apart your first answer. I think we're quite often driven to, what's the question? Give me an answer straight away, move on to the next thing. And I think we need to make a little bit of time to slow things down, to debate, to think about what should the answer look like before we actually try and answer things. And then once we've got an answer, try and pick it apart a little bit and understand, why is that the right answer? Be devil's advocate and encourage people to challenge an answer that you come up with. Use things like focus time, focus sprints to dig into specific objectives rather than working through a laundry list of tick boxes. Actually set aside some time where I know I've got 20 things to do, but actually that one's really important. So I'm going to block out some time to not just get to an answer, but to pick it apart a little bit. And by doing that, you end up blocking out your day with key objectives to achieve, which are focused on your agenda, rather than spending your day getting up in the morning going, oh my God, I've got 100 emails to go through. I'll start going through them one by one, try and pick out what somebody else wants me to do. And you become this reactive person, desperately trying to stay ahead of the ball that's bearing down on you. By the end of the day, you get to a point where I think I've just about stayed ahead. I'm going to log off now, but it's 9 o'clock at night. Who knows what I'm going to get overnight? And in the morning you start it again. We get very tired. And honestly, we get very dull and less interesting by doing that. So I think controlling your time, controlling how you spend your time is really critical to being successful in this age, in this era, particularly with tools like AI. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that totally. We've confused, it's a cliche, but we've confused business with busyness. And I've always been impressed by, I like football, soccer, to anyone who's not British out there. And a player like Eric Cantona had the ability in the middle of a game to slow the ball down. The ball would come to him and he could stand on it. I don't know how he did it. If anyone else did it, it would have immediately been tackled, but he just slowed the whole game down. And I think that's, in terms of leadership quality, is to slow down, to speed up. We've talked about this before, to allow the space for things to synthesize in the head. And getting that time right, because when there are deadlines, it's difficult, is difficult. But I think that's the crucial thing, because we squeezed everything. There's just no time to think. And if there's no time to think, all you can do is react. And then all you're going to do is produce what everyone else is producing. So it's a big shift, given what people have got used to, particularly in lockdown and working from home, when you are literally a little drone on a keyboard just typing. You're not hanging out places and chatting about stuff.
That's a great segue into the next point I want to look at.
Good.
We're more connected than ever, but question is, are we truly participating, or really are we just reacting to stimuli now? What do you think?
Let me just back up a little bit, actually, and talk about the word connected. That's one of the things I wrote about, but there's this term connection, which there's one definition of it is a connection that seems to happen when human beings gather together. There's something about connectivity. It's why churches, temples, it doesn't matter what religion, they always have a pretty similar format, that you gather together somewhere and commune. There's something about human beings communing. There's something about going to a gig or a football game or something. You choose your thing, and there's that kind of connection. And when we feel connected to humanity, if you like, or our fellows or whatever it is, we don't feel anxious. Then there's the other connection, which is the connection to the internet, where there's the obviously physical, digital connection. I say the problem with that, though, is we might be connected to the intellectual conversation, but we're generally not connected to our fellows. So what then tends to happen is people feel very isolated and anxious at all the problems that we're now seeing with people, especially young people, who overuse social media. So that's the preamble to me saying it depends on what we mean by participation. I think I'd like to think that we need to participate as human beings together. And I'm seeing a shift back to that. I'm always doing research like your good self. There seems to be the beginnings of a shift back to that, people wanting to hang out with each other, and to think of digital connection as a means to get information, really, and have communication. There is one caveat to that, which I think is the difference between open and closed communication, because much as in some ways Facebook has died as an open platform, I'd say all its traffic is probably in closed groups. And I live in an area where there's about, I don't know, there's less than 100,000 people in this area. And there's a local Facebook group that has 25,000 people on it. And it's really quite useful. So when you're part of that, you do feel quite connected. And obviously the intimacy you have when you've got a WhatsApp with this, in fact, here we are, right, doing this. So it's not really a yes, no, it depends.
Yeah, I think it comes back to this addiction we've got for short form content, because however you look at it, we're chasing dopamine at the end of the day. And these quick videos, AI, quick answers, they're all triggers for dopamine rewards at the end of the day. And they are addictive. It doesn't really care about depth of engagement. All our brains care about in this instance is the speed of stimulation. So how can we get our next fix by checking our emails, checking our messages on our phone, viewing the next video, getting a quick answer out of ChatGPT. So we train ourselves to need these quick fixes. And the trouble is when we're getting bombarded, particularly when we're doing task switching, we start to see cognitive overload happening when effectively ChatGPT, we have a contextual memory. So we have a certain amount of store that we're working with at any point in time. And when you're getting bombarded by multiple different threads, effectively from your emails to your phone messages to your WhatsApps, we get overloaded. And it's not to say that we can't manage it. We just don't do a particularly good job of it. So you did make me think a little bit when you're talking about WhatsApp versus Facebook. there's quite a big topic here, but I'll try and do a short unpicking. I think when I engage in WhatsApp, I'm probably a bit more thoughtful when I'm talking to people, in the same way as when I'm having a conversation with people. But when I'm engaging on Facebook, when I'm commenting on threads, I think that I'm probably a little bit more system one brain, my simple brain, just digesting something, spitting out an answer, moving on to the next thing. And I do wonder if there is, I'd like to see if there is actually a noticeable difference between them. I think there is a noticeable difference in how I engage, but I think it's very pertinent what you were saying about what do we mean by connection. And for me, it's about adding a meaningful contribution to move something forwards. And I don't think we do that when we react to things. I think we dredge from things which are immediately to hand, and we vomit them out, and we wait for somebody else to do the same thing in return. We just keep this very shallow churn of thoughts that maybe something comes out of, but I think it takes a lot more effort, a lot more engagement, and most of it is throwaway. What actually we're good at as humans is actually slowing things down, digesting a little bit, thinking laterally, allowing ourselves to have stupid questions. And I think it's really important that we break the fear of stupid questions that we all carry with us and force ourselves to go slow a little bit, pausing before speaking, thinking about what you want to say before you actually answer someone, and actually encouraging other people to do the same. And I'm terrible for it. I'm a huge hypocrite. When you're listening to someone talk, before they finish the sentence, you know what you want to say and you want to get it out and contribute. But I think it's really important to just stop yourself, listen and think, even if there's a little bit of a gap. So that's my lesson to myself for today, is to remind myself to do it.
Yeah, this is a big subject. I'll try not to go too deep on this, but we talked a little about this before, being the tyranny of marketing. But if you go back to the beginning of the advertising industry, I don't know if you've come across Edward Bernays, but Edward Bernays was Freud's nephew, and he took Freud's thinking and applied it in the First World War. He was American, for propaganda, and he wrote a book called Business Propaganda, and realized quite quickly that the name wasn't good, so he changed the name to Public Relations. And his thinking, he did the original Lucky Strike adverts when he convinced women to start smoking. His thinking was the DNA of Madison Avenue and the advertising industry. And he realized exactly what you said, this craving for dopamine. But it misses something really important, that dopamine's a side effect. Dopamine's meant to encourage us to do good things. That's the idea of it, is that dopamine makes you focus. So when, biologically, evolutionary wise, you see a partner you think you could procreate with, you go like that, and dopamine goes, feel good, right? So you go, I should go after this. You see some food, and it says, go after this. So the dopamine is tied in with something, which should be focusing on something good. And what advertising has become more and more skilled at over 100 years is tricking us, right? So we get the dopamine for something that isn't good, that makes us feel sick. And in that respect, a lot of memes are just like fast food. They might smell right, but when you eat them, they don't taste right. So I think it's to remember that we don't really crave dopamine, we crave focus. But our brain, we crave good things, and that involves focusing on good things, and the dopamine is a means to facilitate that. So again, we have to try and create a situation where we're not being distracted. In a way, it's like a drug. It is a drug. You either have to go to the gym to feel good, or you take a bit of cocaine, and we have to stop taking the digital cocaine, basically.
Absolutely. And a lot of it comes down to the habits that we form, and we can make deliberate actions to try and at least be aware of what we're doing. And I'm not saying it has to be stopped completely, but I think it's being aware of how much of your time you're spending chasing these quick cognitive fixes versus actually encouraging yourself to think more deeply. I'm struck by the irony that for a long time I've done digital transformation and delivered large enterprise platforms, and for probably 15 years now, maybe a little bit longer, there's been a real encouragement to use things like agile methodologies. So I have to be careful now, as a previous agile coach and as having been recently safe trained and delivered plenty of things through agile, I'm starting to think about how we tend to use agile, and it's not necessarily in its purest form. So if I look at delivering software solutions, digital solutions, we're quite encouraged to think about these sprint-based structures where we focus on how can we deliver as much velocity, as many story points as we can through a sprint. And I think there is a lack of using time spent in things like innovation sprints, which are intended to slow you down, to think about where where you can look at improving solutions, and we start to hit the point where innovation sprints too often have become a luxury, not a critical part of the solution design. And when you start doing that, when you're racing constantly towards an answer, you're typically looking for the first answer being the right answer, and often that's not the case. I think this idea you mentioned earlier about having to force ourselves to go slow is really important, not just for how we train our brains and being good for our personal well-being, or in terms of getting good critical thinking going, but actually much more critical from a business point of view. It's important to get the right solution out, because it's very easy, or relatively easy, to deliver something, but to get the right thing is really important. I know you had an interesting thought on Agile and the sprinting idea. I'd love to hear you go through that.
Yeah, I will. And I'll just add a little bit in, actually. I was thinking there may be some mischief in this word creative, and people who see, because a lot of people in graphic designers and UX designers and things like that will call themselves part of the creative industries. And the analogy I think of is architecture. And if you look at the architecture that wins awards, it's wild and wonderful stuff and very rare. But if you look at the majority of buildings that are built, they're sheds or barrack estates. They're not terribly imaginative, they haven't changed for ages. And I think you have to be honest with yourself about which business you're in. So I think a lot of people who would call themselves creative are more like builders, that they're building the new Barrett estate. They're working on a banking app, and really a banking app doesn't have to be that dissimilar to another banking app. I know it does a bit, but it's not genuine innovation where you want to create Sydney Opera House. So I think there's that distinction that's missing. And when do we need to be innovative? And I think what we're saying, though, is probably with the advent of AI, things where you can get away with a sort of Me Too mimicry kind of product isn't going to work anymore. So we're probably going to have to get a lot better at being genuinely innovative. The question you asked me is, I was always intrigued by just the metaphor of the sprint, in that a sprint in the Olympics is 10 seconds long. And the rest of the time, a sprinter trains, rests, does weight training, probably sleeps a lot, works up to a sprint. We think, why can't you often see 100-meter runners don't run the 200. Some manage it, but often they could, but they won't do the 100 and 200 in one event because they'll wear themselves out. So it's okay to sprint if you build around that rest, space, downtime. But if you're going to sprint and sprint and sprint, you're just going to wear yourself out. There's the burnout that goes with that, but there's obviously the mental exhaustion that comes with that. So I think we've got to work out, is it a marathon or is it a sprint? And if it's a marathon, then it needs a different cadence. And of course, I've never run a marathon, but I've seen people run marathons. You run a bit quickly for a while and you slow down for a while. So you can do that. And I think that's where the dilemma is with Agile.
No, very true. Very true. Great. Thanks for that. I think there's a number of topics I'd like to dig into more with you there, but we're going to run out of time. Maybe we'll come back to another one and dig in some of these, particularly around what's the future of consultancies and also teams, how are they changing with the advent of these new technologies.